Hello.
Oh,
How about that pretty picture on the wall? Is that pretty?
what?
Hey,
Picture on the wall?
you don't say picture.
No.
Splattered paint. Don't look too pretty, does it? Okay, well, we got another one here that's geometric. Anyway, we're looking out about the city of San Francisco. And there's a pretty building right there. And here we can go in on the traffic. Now, if you talk about traffic jams, this is a traffic jam. $5 miles an hour all the way. Both directions.
No rush, no rush. No rush. I know it. What are you going to do, Barbara? Hide? Started. His camera's going. I read for a while and then I like the backlash, you know? Alright, when we get back on you, sit in.
Nation's capital, which it resembles in design.
Do you even take me?
This is what you made is the picture of William. Yes.
See, this is basically what you did.
You know what trip you always look at with it? Camera on that. That old man is so interesting. I like to go for a ride.
Sonoma Valley, okay, that's good. Sometimes people come up here and say we're Napa, which of course we're not. Napa is about 10 miles east of here. Great Cabernets though come from that appellation, of course. So this is Sonoma Valley. Now, did you guys come in from San Francisco?
Yes.
So how'd you like the weather? Quite different, huh? Was it actually pretty clear in the bay?
Oh, yes.
Wow, you guys got lucky. You know how usually in the morning it's overcast quite a bit. And that's what's so great about this appellation is that we get a lot of that overcast weather. But then around noon, of course, the time you show up, it all breaks and then you get all the sun. And that's one of the great reasons why there are so many wonderful wines out here. A lot of grape growers came out here in the early 1900s. In fact, one guy was the grandfather to the owner of this winery, Samuele Sebastiani. Now, how many of you are from Italy? No one, including myself. All right, great. No Italians here. Good deal. Well, our winery was started by Vicky and Sam. Can everyone read this right here? It says Fianza. So the name of the winery is Fianza. And the idea behind the name is Vicky and Sam are the co-proprietors. Sam Sebastiani is a very well-known winemaker. He's been making wine since actually probably the late 50s when he was still a little boy, but all the Italians did that with their grandparents. And so Sam started making wine many years ago, and he's been doing that for about 40 years. But he was the head winemaker at his family winery called Sebastiani Winery. Now, how many of you have heard of Sebastiani Winery? All right. So if you're familiar with that name, then you know about us. Okay, our owner came from that family, but Fianza is a completely separate winery. So the winery here, Fianza, was started back in 1990. We currently produce about 80,000 cases of wine a year. So the big difference between our winery and Sebastiani is they produce a lot of wines. They make great wines, but they sell them all over the world. Okay. Sam started this winery because he wanted to do small production, make it real limited. Okay, and also promote the marriage of food and wine, which of course is really the Italian thing, right? Food and wine. All right, that's how I got converted to wine, just so you know. I'll tell you more about that when we get up to the tasting portion. But Fianza was started because they wanted to promote the Italian roots, the Italian grapes, and also the food and wine. So back in 1990, February 19th, we opened up the doors here to the general public. We've been making wines now here for about 12 years. We actually bought the land in '88, so a lot of this fruit that you see on the vineyard, of course, or vines, we've had planted here for over 10 years. And the main grape that we have on the estate, which has been planted here the longest, is Sangiovese. Now, how many of you are familiar with the grape Sangiovese? All right. You. Now, how many of you are familiar with Chianti? Probably a few more of you can raise it. Okay. So everyone knows Chianti is an area in Italy. It's a fortified area. So whenever you see a Chianti bottle, you know two things right away. You know it's coming from Italy, right? It's made in Italy. And the main grape is Sangiovese. You all knew that, right? Yeah, I bet so. So one of the great things about Viance is we grow 33 different grape species on our vineyard. But our main grape is, again, the Sangiovese. So the first plant we planted is right on this side of the hill, and the grape of Sangiovese was planted back in 1980, or 1988 rather. Keep that on the film. So if anyone is familiar with this, does everyone understand how grapes grow? Just like humans, right? As vines get mature, they get better. All right, so the bottom line is they get better with age, right? Just like humans. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, no one's correcting me. All right, so keep that. So it's funny, but seriously speaking, vines, as they get older, they yield more and more fruit, and the quality is better and better. And that's why you're going to go to a lot of small wineries, and you go up and they say, well, here's a Zin wine, right? And then here's an old vine Zin. And then the old vine Zin's like $30, $40 more because those vines are really limited and they yield really, really awesome fruit. And that's one of the great things about our winery is that we grow a lot of different grapes, but we don't necessarily grow a lot of them. So everything we grow, we do make, of course, wine out of it. And that's why you'll find at Viance that we have a lot of different wines, but some of them are very, very, very limited. So overall, we produce about 80,000 cases, but you got to break that down between 28 different wines a year. And we make the juice, right? But you got to get rid of the stems and all that, as I call it, crap, all that junk you don't need. So the first step we do, and this is really fun to watch, is we use this machine called a destemmer and crusher. In fact, I took a young lady to a few wineries on Monday, and we got to see a winery doing this. And what's really cool is basically you can bring in a big ton of grapes, right, with the stems and everything connected, and they'll basically dump this into this chute right here, okay? Whoa, is this thing moving? All right, stop that right there. So we'll basically dump all the grapes into here, and what's going to happen is all the grapes are going to go through here, through this machine. And what's really cool is there's usually two other mechanisms hooked up. There's a little thing hooked up here, so all the stems are just going to come out here. But all the grapes, guess what, are going to go through here and then through a little pump into another bin. So we're going to have all the juice, the skins, and all that good stuff in one area, and all the stems are just going to go right into a garbage chute right here. So what's really nice about that, remember that, destemmer, crusher. So in other words, we're destemming first, and then we're going to crush the grapes without the stems. So I'm here to tell you there are many machines that they use, and another one they use is a crusher destemmer. So if you think about that, obviously they crush everything first, and then they get rid of stems, which will definitely take more of that earthy aspect out of the wine, and you'll get more of the fruit because you're just dealing with the grapes. So everyone understands when you're picking fruit, the grapes usually, the wine grapes are smaller, right? And if you've ever eaten a grape, right, a wine grape, they're usually, they're real tart, and they're full of tannins. So wine grapes are usually small because guess what? All the color, all the fruit comes from the skins of the grapes. All right. So whenever you take a bite out of a grape, if you look inside, 99% of all grapes in the world are actually clear in color. And so all the color in a wine comes from the skins of the grapes. And that's why, as I'm going to move into fermentation, but what they do when they make white Zin, and you wonder why it's so cheap, right? You can make tons of it. But what they basically do is they put it into a fermentation tank for only about 45 minutes. Okay, because you really don't want to convert a lot of those sugars out of the grapes, right? What you want to do is you want to take a little bit of the sugars, okay, and distract a little bit of the color from the skins. So the bottom line is it doesn't take long to make rosés. It's very easy to do them, and that's why most wineries make a lot of it, because of course you can sell it for a lot more. And so we make a wine called In Bianco here. And In Bianco is Italian for in the style of white. And what's so unique is that we do not make any white Zinfandel here. So I had to break your heart right now. We don't make any white Zinfandel. But promoting the Italian grapes, we make a wine called Barbera Rosé. So it's the same thing, only we're taking the fruit from a Barbera grape, which is a very native Italian grape, rather than the Zinfandel grape. Still got that camera on me?
Yes, sir.
And feel free, if anyone has a just a regular camera, feel free to take photographs. All right, let's come a little closer so Sean can get through. So how do you like the smells in here? It smells nice, huh? Pretty cool too. Yeah. Now it's real important, as a winery, of course, you'll notice in this room we have a lot of oak barrels. And one thing you got to remember, ladies and gentlemen, is I don't know everyone personally here, but if you do collect wines, when you have wine in your bottle aging, it is very crucial that it's stored in a fairly consistent room. So a lot of people say you don't want it to get too hot or too cold. Well, the number one thing is you don't want it to go up and down. Okay, if it's at a 65-degree temperature, keep it there. Once it starts to fluctuate, that's where your wines go bad. But in this room, obviously, we have oak. And you can easily lose out of that 60 gallons about 5 to 10 gallons if we did not keep this room in a good temperature. So always remember that. Got to store your good wines in a very good room. And always, of course, you got to keep it away from your friends, because if it's good wine, you don't want.
Tell us about the area, why people should come here, why is it so special?
Okay, well, I'm Paula Menace, and I'm the tasting room manager here at Little Vineyards. We're in the heart of Sonoma Valley, and this valley, because it's kind of a curving valley, unlike other valleys in wine country, we have lots of different exposures, and so that allows us to do a wider variety of grapes well. There are certain regions that are known as cool regions that are good for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, for example, and hotter climates like Napa and northern Sonoma that are good for Cabernet. In this valley, because of the varied terrain and sun exposure, we can do a really wide range of grapes. So we can do everything from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir up to Cabs. So anyway, that's what makes this area, to me, really special and unique and such a great location for a.
Today we're headed to a place called Columbia, and it's an old gold mining town, and it's in California also, just not far from San Francisco. Here we go. Gotcha.
No buffalo here, no. But you would have eaten things like deer meat, bear meat was a very popular meat of the time. You would have eaten maybe some elk or any of the wild game that would be locally be able to get caught in here, like quail or some of those animals.
It's been good.
It's been very good, and one of the delicacies of a restaurant like this would have been to have fresh oysters for a meal. And a lot of people, where'd they get oysters from? Well, they got them from San Francisco Bay. In the 1800s, San Francisco Bay was one of the best oyster producing areas of the world. And so they would go out and harvest those oysters from the bay, and they shipped them up here into the gold country, and people ate oysters as a delicacy. No. They pack them up in nice, damp, cool material. No ice, but they damp and cool material. And they'd ship them up here, and you'd have fresh oysters. Well, think about eating oysters sitting in San Francisco. How many of you would eat a piece of meat out of a butcher shop like that, just hanging out there? I mean, there's no refrigeration in that building. And that is the butcher shop. And so you went up there, you told him you need a slab of meat, and he'd just whack a hunk off there for you. It might be hanging there for a couple weeks on that little hook. There's no air conditioning in there. There's nothing in there. Actually, what they had in there is they had a innovative ventilation system they created in there, and they put pipes that went all the way through the back wall and tried to move air circulating around. In the old days, it wasn't glass in the face of the building either. It had screens. It just had big screens made on the face of the building. So the flies wouldn't get in there. But I can't imagine going in a place like that and getting my meat today. What kind of foodborne diseases did these people get? So the oysters are probably very good compared to some of that stuff hanging in there. And a lot of people wonder about the chickens in there. Are they real chickens? Yes, there are some real chickens in there that are hanging in there. They're freeze-dried chickens. They're freeze-dried today.
Not rubber.
Well, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Craig Matson, and I'm the Chief Ranger of the Calaveras District, and this is one of my parks here at Columbia. This is Columbia State Historic Park, and Columbia is here because in the 1940s, some people like Mrs. McConnell actually lives in the house right across the street here. It's a private residence. Her and her husband fought and actually lobbied the California State Legislature and the Governor of California to create a state park here. The buildings were already in partial ruins at the time, by the 1940s, and so she fought to have it protected as a state park. But our history goes all the way back to 1850. In 1850, gold was discovered here. A party of of settlers happened to be moving through. There was no towns around here yet, so there wasn't a town of, there wasn't a town of Columbia, there wasn't a town of Sonora. None of these towns existed. It was actually just open land out here, and people were moving through. The gold rush was already going on. Gold had been discovered up at Sutter's Mill, north of here, up towards Coloma, but no gold had really been discovered here yet. So this party ended up camping out behind some buildings on that end of town, where the buildings are today. They camped along the creek down there. They went down to get their water, and what did they see? They saw gold sitting in this seasonal stream. And it started a whole rush of gold seekers to the area. So we started a new place in California. The name of this town was Hildreth Diggins. That was the original name of our town. And the town grew very fast. Town didn't look anything like it does today. You're going to have to let your imaginations go a little bit again and think about town. There were no brick buildings in town. There were no wood buildings in town. There was nothing here. There was not even a town anywhere near here. But what they did is they started building a town. Oh, thank you. And they started building a town out of tents. So a tent city sprang up here in Columbia. Anybody ever seen the film Paint Your Wagon?
Oh, yes.
You guys see some of that tent town going? Columbia is very similar to that. This instant boom town being built up and growing very fast. Well, one thing happened in Columbia, which happened in every town of that era, is it burned to the ground. And why would a town burn down so easily? Anybody know how they heated their houses? Wood. How they lit their houses and buildings? Fire again. So it was really easy to burn everything down. They did do it twice in the very early 1850s. The town burned to the ground. So the people who were settling here and were building this town started looking around for materials to make brick, because they came from areas where brick buildings existed. They knew that they were fire resistant and that they would last a long time if they were made out of brick. So they went out in the local area and they started making their own brick. And they made it by either sun drying the bricks or kiln drying the bricks. They made them both ways and started building the buildings as you see them today. As the town started to grow, they realized that the name Hildreth Diggins wasn't a very good name. It's a very temporary name. This town was going to be a permanent town. It was going to become a big city. And so they renamed the town American Camp. But they didn't like that either. The name Camp associated with the town didn't want to be a camp. They wanted to be a city, so they named it Columbia. And that name stuck, and that's where our name comes from today, Columbia. Let's walk across the street. Normally we start a tour at the Fallon Hotel and we walk to the City Hotel. So you get the timeline's going to be a little different. But you got to, when you're here, let your imagination go a little bit. In a minute you're going to hear, you can hear it right now, hear a different language in the background. It's Chinese that you hear. And imagine Columbia. Is anybody here from a foreign country? Where are you from? Germany. Germany. Okay. Well, people that came here came from Germany, they came from France, they came from Russia, they came from South America, they came here from Mexico, they came from all over the world when gold was discovered here. Columbia was a multicultural city. You had every culture of the world coming here looking for their riches. And so you would have heard things in the background like Chinese. You would have heard German being spoken on the streets. This was the French bakery, this building here, so you would have heard French being spoken. They spoke their native languages. They cooked their native foods. And one thing you had in there is you had probably pretty traditional food you're probably all accustomed to. But you would have may have gone in and they may have a delicacy. They might have German food tonight, or they might have Mexican food another night. So they had all the different delicacies that people could make of the local area. And one thing, the reason I wanted to stop here was because we have this Chinese drugstore that's behind us here. And a lot of people see that and they go, wow, the Chinese, right in the center of town. Chinese were never in the center of town. This is totally contrary to history of the gold rush. This is a Chinese drugstore. It's an actual drugstore. It was reclaimed from Sacramento and brought here, what's in there. But what happened was the Chinese, when they came here, they didn't look like any of us. They didn't look like Europeans or Americans. They looked so different that they were discriminated against. And the Chinese were forced to the edges of town. They had to live on the outskirts of town. So you never would have seen a Chinese drugstore in the middle of town. They would have been on the outskirts of town. The Chinese wouldn't even hardly come into town because they were discriminated against. What was one of the worst things you could do to a Chinese man? Anybody know? Cut off it's actually called the queue. It's called the queue, and that is a very spiritual. It's spiritually significant to a Chinese man. It's like the ladder to send you into heaven, type of thing. And so, if you were to cut off a Chinese man's queue, he was first of all embarrassed, and he couldn't go home, couldn't go back to China until he grew back, because he would be disgraced. And then there was this fear that he couldn't go to heaven if he died. So it was one of the worst things you could do to Chinese people, and that happened in the gold rush. People corner a Chinese man, they cut off his queue, and it's one of the worst things you could do to a Chinese man. Now, one thing the Chinese are somewhat hated for in the 1800s is their use of a drug. You may know what drug the Chinese used? Opium. And why they're hated for using opium is really mind-boggling to me. Because everybody else in Colombia used opium as well. We didn't call it opium, though. We called it laudanum. And laudanum was the common drug of its day. You'd go to the local store. There were no, you didn't have to go to a drugstore with a prescription to get laudanum. You'd walk in and say, just like a bottle of aspirin, I need to get a bottle of laudanum, please. And the guy would give you a bottle of laudanum, and you take it, maybe relieve a headache or any pain that you have. So we used laudanum, they used opium, but where it's all the same stuff. It's no different. So the discrimination part was kind of unreasonable. The Chinese, though, were probably the most industrious miners that came to the gold camps. They didn't do like the Americans and Europeans did. Americans and Europeans like to do it the fast way. We want to get our riches and get out. The Chinese didn't think that way. They wanted to get rich, but they wanted to get really rich. And what the Chinese would do, I mentioned we discovered gold, and we discovered what's called placer gold. Placer gold is the gold that settles in for millions of years, washed out of the Sierra Nevada foothills, and settles into the streams and rivers throughout this band of the Sierra Nevada foothills in California. That gold is placer gold, and it was laid there millions of years ago, and that's what they discovered. Well, the Americans would go there, and the way you work placer gold is with a pan or a sluice box or a rocker box, but the Americans would go take a shovel of dirt, throw it in the pan or a rocker box, and work that out. Well, all the gold would wash away because the little flakes of stuff they didn't worry about. It just wash away. It's like, we don't need that. We get the bigger stuff. Well, the Chinese didn't think that way. Chinese would go and they would do what a lot of times is often termed as teaspoon mining. And what that is you take a very small amount of dirt, you put it in a gold pan, and you work that gold, and you take every little flake of gold out of that dirt. And you get rich doing that. Those little flakes start adding up to be big amounts of gold. So they got rich. The Chinese oftentimes couldn't even get a mining claim because they were discriminated against. They were hated. The government, no, you can't get a claim. And so they would work areas that Europeans and Americans had already worked. And so they would work those areas, and they still struck it rich. They still made it rich and sent millions of dollars from California back home to China. Now, one thing that's interesting about Colombia today, there's no Chinese here. You don't hear any languages except English here today. The multicultural aspect is somewhat gone. Chinese all left. Wouldn't you leave if you were discriminated against that bad? They went to places where they could live close to their own people, and they settled in places like San Francisco, where we have Chinatown, and those places today where they can live their own culture and their own life. But that multicultural part is gone, so you won't see any of that in Colombia today. The other thing that's different about Colombia is you're all standing most of you standing in the street out here today. In those days, 1850s, you'd be standing in mud out there. And imagine that mud. You've got horses going up and down the street. And what do horses do best? That's right. They go to the bathroom out in the middle of the street, and it just gets pounded into that dirt and mud. But on a good hot day, can you just imagine that smell coming out of there? And remember, there's no toilets in town. No flush toilets. It's all outhouses. Imagine that cooking out there all day and starting to smell. And then all the smells of the ethnic cooking going on. It was quite a place, a lot different than it is today. And a lot of people think that gold mining is a very a glamorous thing to do. It's not glamorous at all. How many of you would want to go wander out in this creek of freezing water, stand up to your knees or maybe even up to your waist with a gold pan, bending over all day, trying to get a little bit of gold out of that dirt? That is not very glamorous. You wouldn't want to do that very long. Many of the people that came here, that actually opened up these businesses, came here looking for gold. They got here and realized, hey, that is too hard to work. It's a lot easier for me to open a business, and I'll take the gold right out of the pockets of the miners. And that's exactly what they did. They started opening up businesses, and Columbia became the commercial center of this area. Columbia became the big city. And it's hard to imagine Columbia as a city today. In the 1850s, this was a city, a big city. Sonora was discovered in 1851. It's their 150th anniversary this year. We're a year older than Sonora. Sonora didn't even exist yet. So it's kind of, this was the city, and when California became a state, they were looking for a new state capital, and Columbia was considered to become the state capital. It lost in the legislature by 2 votes to become the capital of the state of California. Can you imagine this if it was Sacramento today? None of these buildings would be here. Shorter people, so the door handle heights today were shorter, so are lower to the ground. The reason we had full-length doors on most of many of the buildings was for air circulation. If you wanted to get the air to circulate, you just open up the doors and let the air move around through the building. They didn't put windows on because then you'd have lesser air movement. So they put these big doors on the building. Come on in, have a seat. We'll pick somebody to hang in a minute.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Sure. I have no idea how. Well, human longevity? I would be an old man. I would be pretty old. You know, living into your 70s and 80s was great.
35, 40?
40s and 50s. You know, you're starting to get up there, and diseases and things start taking their toll by then. So medicine wasn't quite like it is today. The reason we came in here is because we're in the last operating courthouse in Columbia. This is the last court in town. And it's not much different than a modern courthouse. Somebody may have noticed that these chairs, witnesses might sit here. Of course, whoever's defending themselves or whoever's on the stand having to tell what dastardly deed they did might be sitting here. Attorneys here, and of course your audience here. The judge here, and the court reporter would sit here. And they would write everything by hand with a pen. Have to write everything would have to be written by hand. And so court cases would take place in it. However, in the early days of Columbia, court cases didn't happen in buildings like this. They happened in buildings that are like across the street. Somebody was picked up for doing a major crime. What would a crime be in those days, you think?
Stealing a horse?
Stealing a horse, what's that? Robbery. Claim jumping. Those are the kind of things you might get in trouble with. And so if you got brought into court, and there was no court system yet, they had to establish their own court. So you might take one of the local citizens and say, well, you can be the judge today, and we'll pick the rest of you. You guys can be the jury, and the rest of you be audience. And who wants to be the attorney to defend Mr. So-and-so here? You know, and that's how they did it. That's how early courts happened in California. As the court system moved in, we started to see regular courthouses being built like we have here. And this is the typical courthouse. Looks just like a modern court. The court system in the United States hasn't changed much. Anybody notice the picture on the wall? Washington, Bill George, first president of the United States. And somebody may notice the reward poster on the back there. Black Bart. Black Bart was one of our famous robbers of the local area. He liked to hold up people and steal their gold. And that was get a reward of $1,000 in gold coin.